Well, I'm feeling a little bit sad this morning because our series on Daniel is coming to an end, and I've really enjoyed reading through it. I've enjoyed studying it. I can't believe the band waited till the last week to play Daniel. You could have played it for all 4 weeks, but we've missed out. Joe's not even listening, so whatever. It's fine. It's my favourite, but that's okay. But over the last few weeks, we've been learning what it means to stand through the life of Daniel. And we've learned in week 1, if you remember back, that Daniel stood out. Daniel resolved not to defile himself, and because of that, he stood out and he honoured God with every single part of his life. And we also learn in week 2, Phil taught us a bit about what it means to stand up in the right way with the goal of restoration. See, Daniel could see and he could interpret the dreams of King Nebuchadnezzar, and he did so cautiously and courageously in the right way. And then last week, we were reminded that Daniel stood strong. Daniel was consistent. He was faithful. He'd rose to this influential position, and it made the Babylonian leaders quite jealous, and they plotted to get Daniel killed. But again, we see that he's obedient. He's consistent. He made habits that got him ahead, and he trusted in God with the results because he knew what God was doing. He knew what God could do in and through him. And this week, we're going to see that Daniel also stood in faith. So I just want to encourage you this week, if you have missed some of it, go back and have a look. You can go on our website or on our podcast on iTunes or through our app or on YouTube. Go back and listen to either one of these first 3 messages that you might have missed out on. Because actually what we're talking about today, it has so much more weight when we understand the whole context of Daniel's life and what he went through. So go back and listen to those if you haven't already. But Daniel chapter 10 that we're looking at today, it's about this revelation that comes to Daniel through a vision. And while there's many interesting elements to this revelation, if you read on in Daniel chapter 11, it actually isn't our focus this morning. See, it's the experience of Daniel leading up to and during this vision that we're going to focus on, that shows us the things that we ought to remember if we want to live lives where we continue to stand in faith. See, I reckon Daniel's whole life is an example to us of what it means to stand in faith, to trust in what we can't see, to hold on to God's promise despite our circumstance. But here, closer to the end of Daniel's life, God shows us the things that he does, not the things that Daniel does, the things that God does to enable us to stand in faith and to continue standing in faith as Daniel did. But before we get into Daniel's story this morning, I thought it was worth us spending a little bit of time discussing what faith actually is and how we then stand in it. Because for many of us, I think here this morning, we would put our hands up and say that faith is the most important thing in our lives. Am I right about that? Faith is the most important thing. But we often struggle to define it. So I went to trusty old Google this week and I typed in faith. And do you know what came up? I think it's going to come up on the screen. It's complete trust or confidence in someone or something. It's a pretty good definition, isn't it? Complete trust or confidence in someone or something. But you know, even more helpful from Google this week was learning the definition from Jesus. And there's a story in Luke 7 about this centurion who sends for Jesus because his servant is sick. And he knows that Jesus is in the area, so he sends for Jesus to heal his servant. And so Jesus goes, okay, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to heal this servant. But as he approaches the centurion's house, the centurion knows and he sends word and says, you know what, Jesus, I'm not even worthy to have you under my roof. You don't need to come because I know that if you just say the word, Jesus, my servant is going to be healed. And verse 9 tells us that when Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith, even in Israel. See, this could be perhaps be an indication for us that what Jesus thought faith was simply taking him at his word. See, the centurion knew that if Jesus just spoke the word, his servant would be healed. He didn't need Jesus to be in his house. He didn't even need to see Jesus, but he was sure of who Jesus was and what Jesus had the power to do. And then Paul goes on to talk about this faith, what faith really is for us, again in Hebrews 11, 1-2. He tells us that the fundamental fact of existence is that this trust in God, this faith, is the firm foundation under everything that makes life worth living. It's our handle on what we can't see. The act of faith is what distinguished our ancestors, set them above the crowd. And if you've read Hebrews 11 before, you'll know that Paul goes on to list all of these people from Scripture who are the heroes in the faith, who stood in faith, who trusted God and held on to what he promised. And all these people that Paul lists, they had one thing in common. They'd simply taken God at his word and they'd obeyed his command. They'd simply trusted in God's promise. And as Paul lists all these people, he's saying, guys, how many more examples did you need? And sometimes I reckon God's saying that to me. Sarah, how many more examples do you need? You know that I'm a faithful God. You've seen me do it before. I'm going to do it again. My way's best. You just have to trust me. You have to take me at my word. You have to have complete trust in confidence in me. Because for us to actually stand in faith, it means that we don't just have faith for a season or for a moment. We continue to have faith all the days of our lives. Because I reckon sometimes our feelings and our experiences, they can get in the way of us having faith, standing in faith. We let those things control us. Or instead of doing that, we can actually make it a habit, as Daniel did, of taking God at his word and trusting in his promise. So this passage that we're going to look at this morning that we read earlier from Daniel 10, it actually gives us three things that we can be sure of when we stand in faith. Three things that we need to be continually reminded of as we stand out and we stand up and we stand strong, if we want to live as Daniel did and continue to stand in faith. And the first thing that we see this morning that God gives us when we stand in faith is that God uses weakness. See, at the beginning of this passage, it starts off with Daniel acknowledging that he's been in mourning. Daniel chapter 10 verse 2 says, "At that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks." And you know, in the Bible, these ancient Jewish mourning customs, they were often associated with preparation for a vision from God. And we're not told exactly why Daniel's mourning, but we do know in the previous chapter, Daniel's been praying to God. He's been pleading for answers, that God would come and once again restore his people. And he's praying that God would not give up on them. And do you know what God's answer is? Not yet, Daniel. Not yet. So Daniel's at this place where he's weak. And I don't know if you realise this, Rebecca pointed it out last week, and I don't know that it had truly sunk into me till I studied this a bit more. But you know what? Daniel was well into his 80s at this point in time. His 80s. He's lived an entire lifetime in Babylon. Remember week 1, we talked about Daniel and his young friends being taken by King Nebuchadnezzar and trained up. So at this point in time, Daniel has been praying for literally decades that God would restore his people, that God would restore the temple that had been destroyed. Daniel keeps hanging on to God's promise. But if you've ever prayed for something for that long, you know that it's hard. Daniel begins to become weary. He's old. He hasn't seen the results that he longs for. But we see in one of Daniel's weakest moments that God reveals his presence. How often does that happen for us? How often when we're at our weakest point does God reveal himself to us when we're most ready to give up? And you know, this happened to me a few weeks ago. Rebecca and I went to Queensland. We'd been asked to speak at their divisional youth councils. We were all prepped and excited and ready to go, and we arrive and we go into the first session on Friday night, and I got up and spoke, and it went okay. And after worship kind of wrapped up and we'd prayed, I came and sat back down and I started talking to Rebecca, and she's like, "Sarah, what's going on with your voice?" And I literally sounded like Darth Vader. I don't know what had happened, but I didn't feel very sick, right? So I felt okay. I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go to bed. I'm just going to rest my voice. I'm going to wake up in the morning. I'm going to be fine. So the next morning we get up. I feel pretty good. I go to talk and I'm like, "Good morning, Rebecca." Except it wasn't even that good because I couldn't get any words out. It was awful. My voice was completely shot. And as the day went on, it just got worse and worse and worse. Luckily, Rebecca was preaching in the morning, so I had some time to rest my voice, which is actually incredibly hard to do when you're at a youth camp, just by the way. We kept going on. My voice kept getting worse. So we went out and we bought some disgusting throat gargle thing. Anyone ever use one of those? It's pretty terrible. And I bought every type of lozenge known to man. And I kept taking them and whatever. I wasn't feeling any better. So I start to panic a little bit, to be honest. I had to preach that night. And I'm thinking seriously, God, I haven't lost my voice ever in my entire life. And I'm here and I'm trying to do your thing. I'm trying to preach your word, God. And this is when you make me lose my voice. So we get ready for the session and I literally still couldn't get two words out without dying. And I can feel that as we walk down to the session, Rebecca's a little bit panicked as well because she kind of knows that if I can't do it, she's going to have to jump up and somehow cover for me. So everything's a little bit tense. We go down to where the worship team is and we go in and we pray as we'd done at the beginning of the other sessions. And they pray for the session and they pray for me and my voice. And I'm kind of thinking, come on, God, now's the time. I'm going to walk out of this room and I'm going to be all healed and it's going to be all fine. No, didn't happen. Still nothing. So the service starts and I keep praying. I keep popping these lozenge things. Had way more than what you're supposed to. But it still wasn't working. I'm trying to sing a little bit to see if my voice come out. Gets to about 5 minutes before I got to get up on stage and I go outside. I do my nasty throat gargle thing, try and talk to myself. Still nothing's coming out. And I'm like, okay, God, this is it. This is your moment because I've got nothing. You either make it work or you don't. And I walk back inside and we're singing this song in worship called Faithfulness. And it says, words like, in everything, our God is faithful. Now and for always, our God is faithful. And in that moment, as I worshipped, I just felt this wave come over me. That's the only way I can describe it. And I just felt this deep sense of God's presence. And in that moment, I was like, I can speak. I'm going to be fine. And I got up on the stage and opened my mouth and preached for 20, 25 minutes. It was pretty much a miracle considering that 15 minutes before I literally couldn't get more than 2 words out. See, God used me in my physical weakness when I had become completely reliant on Him, when I felt like I had nothing to give, when I was weak and I couldn't speak. That was when God revealed His presence to me. And it was the same for Daniel. Because let's clarify something this morning. Being weak is not the same as losing faith. Being weak just makes us more reliant. Being weak reveals to us how much we need the one that we put our faith in. God uses us in our weakness. And I like this part of the book of Daniel because it reveals to us that actually Daniel was still human. Yeah, he was an exemplary guy, but he was human. He struggled. He was weak sometimes, just like we get weak. Our bodies get weak. Our minds get weak. But weakness for Daniel in this moment, it wasn't an indication of a lack of faith. It's okay for us to feel weak at times because we know, as Scripture tells us, that God's power is made perfect in weakness. So Daniel's been mourning. He's been fasting. And one day he's out on the bank of the river and he sees this angelic figure. And other people are with him, but they don't see. Others run away in terror at the glory of this angelic being. And Daniel's so overwhelmed that he loses all strength. But he manages somehow to stay put. And this angel comes and touches Daniel. And he's able to stand. So God uses weakness. We can be sure of that when we stand in faith. And the second thing we can be sure of this morning is that God is always listening. See, after Daniel, the angel stood Daniel up again. He says in verse 12, "Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them." See, Daniel has been praying and fasting and mourning for 3 weeks. And that might not seem like a very long time to pray for something. But actually, Daniel ate no choice food, no meat, and he didn't use lotions over that time. And I don't know about anyone else, but if I go 3 weeks without using deodorant, it's not good. And when I look at it that way, I'm like, man, actually 3 weeks is a long time to intentionally commit to praying and fasting and to hear nothing. And on top of that, 60 or 70 years is an awfully long time for Daniel to be faithfully praying for God to restore his people and not lose hope that God would do something. And if you're a person that prays, I am sure there have been times in your life where you've prayed for something or someone faithfully and all you hear from God is silence. You commit to praying for someone that you love, someone in your family who's far from God, and you hear nothing. You pray for a job or you pray for direction in your life and you hear nothing. You pray for healing physically in your relationships, in your mind, but you just don't feel like anything changes. And when this happens to us, it's discouraging. And we begin to question if God's even listening. Are our prayers being heard? Is there any point? But this angel assures Daniel. He tells him not to be afraid, that his prayers have been heard since the moment they were spoken. Daniel didn't see anything, but just because he didn't see anything did not mean that God was not doing something. Just because Daniel didn't see didn't mean that God was not doing something. See, this angelic figure goes on to tell Daniel that he was sent in response to Daniel's prayer. In verse 13 to 14, the angelic figure says, "But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come." See, there was this spiritual battle going on from the moment that Daniel opened his mouth. Spiritual warfare is a real thing when we pray. There's this spiritual battle going on that so often we don't hear of, we don't know, we don't understand. We have no idea what kind of battle is going on behind the scenes. And we know this because in Ephesians 6:12, we're reminded that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the power of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. See, God is listening, always. And just because we don't hear a response when we think we ought to, doesn't mean that our prayers aren't being answered. There's more going on than we know. There was more going on than Daniel knew. So like Daniel, we keep praying. We keep holding on to what God's promised. And this angelic figure tells Daniel that he's been listening, that God's been listening, his prayers have been heard. And in that moment, once again, Daniel's overwhelmed and he can't speak. So the angel reaches out and touches Daniel's lips so that he can talk. But Daniel's still weak. His strength is gone and he can hardly breathe. So once again, this angelic figure touches Daniel in verse 18. And this touch, it strengthens Daniel. It enables him to focus on the revelation that is to come. And this is where we find our third point this morning. That God's plan often comes after God's touch. God's plan often comes after his touch. And you know what? I don't like this point very much. Because I want the plan. When I pray, when I ask God for something, I want to know what's going to happen. I want to know what's going to go down. I want God to show me how things are going to work out. I don't want to just be comforted because I like to be in control. But actually what we see in this story is if that angel had just swooped in and shouted this message at Daniel that it was sent to deliver, Daniel probably would have missed it. He was too weak to even hear it, let alone to process it, to take it in, to then share it with other people. The angel had to encourage and strengthen Daniel so that he could receive the message that he needed to hear. The touch of this angelic figure, it enabled Daniel to move, to stand, to speak. And perhaps for us, for some of us, when we feel most weak, when we're struggling to hold on to God's promise, what we need most is not his plan, not the answers, but his touch. to have an encounter with God that enables us to move forward, to see clearly, to trust when we don't understand the plan. And you know what? Even when we can't understand the plan, when we can't see it, we can be assured that his way is best because we have a faith in a God who is at work in all of time, all of space, all of history. And when it seems to us like the timing is wrong, like something is taking too long, like an exile in Babylon or a hard relationship or a sickness that we want to be free from, we have to remember that God is always at work and his timing is always right. Sometimes what we need is not his plan, but his touch, because that's what enables us to stand in faith. Daniel needed that touch in that moment. He needed that encounter with God, that comfort from the God that he put his faith in, the same God that we put our faith in. And you know, I love where that passage from Hebrews that we looked at earlier, where it ends. Because after Paul's listed all these heroes of the faith, all these people that we sort of put up there as people who stood in faith for such a long time, he says this: not one of these people, even though their lives of faith were exemplary, got their hand on what was promised. Not one. God had a better plan for us, that their faith and our faith would come together to make one completed whole, their lives of faith not complete apart from ours. They were all sure of what they could not see. They all held to the promise. And the story of Daniel, as that video pointed out earlier, it gives us this hope that motivates faithfulness. Daniel had complete trust and confidence in God. He knew he could take him at his word, even though he didn't always see or understand what God was doing. In fact, he rarely did. And this morning, we're going to listen to a new song. The words are going to come up on the screen, and we're just going to listen this morning. And it talks about putting our trust in a God who is faithful, standing in faith because we've seen God at work, and we know that he'll do it again. The chorus of this song, it says, "Your promise still stands. Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands. This is my confidence. You have never failed me yet." And this morning, as we listen, I want to invite you to respond. Because I'm sure this morning here that there's people who feel like Daniel did. You feel weak. You feel tired. You've prayed for something to come to pass, and you don't see it yet. And you wonder in that moment, is God listening? Is God working? And we want to pray for you this morning because, you know, we believe that God is listening. We believe that he is at work and that his timing is right. And maybe this morning, what you need most is not God's plan mapped out for you, is not all the answers to all of your questions, but what you need is God's touch, an encounter with the living God. So I want to invite you, if that's you this morning, to come and pray. And maybe for some of us this morning, you've been through times when you've struggled to stand in faith, but you did it and God came through for you. And you just want to thank him for that this morning. Maybe it wasn't in your timing. Maybe it wasn't in the ways that you expected him to do it, but he did. And you just want to spend this time thanking God for his promise and ask him to enable you to continue to stand in faith. So we're going to watch, the words are going to come up on the screen this morning, but I just want to invite you to spend some time reflecting and praying, and if you'd like this morning, to come and to kneel and to pray and to say, God, I want to be a person like Daniel who's going to stand in faith for all the years of my life.